Over the last few years, I've occasionally seen videos with titles like "A New Renaissance is Coming." And it seems like this is a conversation that's been happening for a little while. And I recently just watched another video on this subject, and I've seen a number of them, like I said, throughout the last few years. And when one comes up on my feed, I'll watch it, and then maybe I'll pick it apart a little bit. But this most recent one, I thought it was an interesting video, and some of the points that he made about the state of the academy today were very accurate, I think, and helpful. But I want to talk a little bit about why I just don't think that there is going to be another Renaissance. And I think that that's the case in our culture today. But in some ways, I also think that there never actually could be another Renaissance. I'm not sure that it is actually possible. And I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why I think that's the case. The first one of these is going to deal with the contemporary situation and arguments that have been made. Now, there's a historical argument that says that the rebirth of learning tends to arise in times of collapse, social collapse, and in very hard times. People kind of turn maybe toward the humanities. And while I think that that may be true if you're looking at the Renaissance in the medieval period, or perhaps to some degree when you're looking at Romanticism, which if you want to call that a kind of Renaissance, perhaps you can. But if you're looking at, say, those 2 particular time periods, yes, there were a lot of kind of problems socially that were occurring at that time. But those were also time periods that were ripe with learning and clarity of thought. The era of the Renaissance, if you're looking at the 15th into the 16th century, was not a time where there was a dearth of learning. It was not a time where there was a lack of serious education, serious engagement with ideas. The medieval scholasticism has generally been seen to have largely declined by the 15th century. But that decline is really not one of a loss of intellectual rigor. If you read, the one who's considered often the last of the medieval scholastics, Gabriel Biel, his works are quite intellectually engaging. There are a lot of problems, I think, with Biel's arguments, but one couldn't really accuse someone like Biel or even Occam before him as being intellectual lightweights. And yes, the scholasticism had become stale, it had become abstractified, it had become divorced from everyday life, from practical reason, it had become divorced from the mystical tradition, whereas the scholastic and mystical tradition in the best parts of the Middle Ages really aligned pretty strongly with one another, where you didn't have the strong head-heart divide. But you do get that during the later scholastic era. So there are plenty of problems with late scholasticism, but those who are engaged in this field still are getting the tools to learn and think clearly, to engage with sources clearly, though not yet without the clearer tools that you find in the Renaissance in terms of the examination of texts. And the same is true if you're looking at the rise of Romanticism, whether you're looking at the Sturm und Drang or whatever kind of romantic movement you're examining, is that they're in a milieu of learning. The Enlightenment prioritized learning, prioritized rationality, prioritized scientific discovery. And so the Romantic movement does not actually respond to a lack of learning. What the Romantic movement is responding to is a learning that is so focused on principles of bare reason that it doesn't actually engage everyday life. It doesn't engage the arts. It has become kind of stale. That's not what we're facing today. The culture that we are in today is not one that has become stale because it's become too rational. And our culture today is without any significant grounding in classical principles of philosophy or reasoning, or even in learning on how to engage a text at all. Those basic pieces have to be put together before you can have a reaction that is something like a Renaissance. If anything, I think a reaction today, a kind of reactionary movement today, would probably be one that would look a little bit more like rationalism than Romanticism. They would look probably a little bit more like a movement to actually instruct people about the basic principles of reasoning and of logic and engaging in ideas. And I think without any kind of rational groundwork, you'd have a hard time seeing any kind of real renaissance in the arts. And I don't even know how something like that would really be possible today. Now, there obviously are movements in the arts from those who are trying to recapture something like a classical conception of beauty. And I think that's very good, to be clear. But at the same time, I think a lot of those movements are more attempts at repristinating, recapturing an era that is bygone. When a lot of paintings are clearly imitations of classical paintings, when your paintings are dealing with just, say, themes from Greek mythology, and something is true of poetry and other attempts at revival, it feels a little bit like a mere imitation of the past than it does something that is actually bringing truths that are even old truths into a contemporary context. And one could, of course, say that about the Renaissance as well. And the Renaissance did see itself as a movement that's really going back rather than going forward, back ad fontes, back to the sources. So that's true to some degree, but you need to have some level of both recapturing that which is classical and also then incorporating something that is more contemporary so that you're not merely repeating what's already been done. Because at that point, any kind of contemporary author, poet, artist who's using these more classical themes and is just doing kind of an imitation of something that was done in, the 18th century or the 15th century, I'd rather just go back to those older sources because they're going to do it better. So that's something that I've seen even in those kind of attempts at recapturing some of this that they, I think, have missed as well. So I just don't think that the situation that we have today is really synonymous with the situations in which you do have this kind of rebirth in the arts in various times in history. The second thing, and I think this is a major issue, is when you look at these great figures in history who were conversant across fields, people who were able to engage in the sciences and philosophy and the arts and theology, the field of knowledge itself was so much narrower than it is today, which means that people were able to actually become generalists. People were able to do interdisciplinary work. People were able to actually see knowledge as a series of interconnected themes and ideas, rather than looking at one particular small sliver of some field of knowledge, becoming an expert in whatever that little sliver is. It's become basically impossible now to have a generalized knowledge enough that you could actually speak in a general sense about various fields, that people would actually listen to you without immediately jumping on the fact that you have misrepresented some little sliver of knowledge that someone is an expert in because you haven't considered every interpretive school that has come about in this person's thought in the last 200 years. I see this all the time because in my own work, I try to be I am a generalist. I try to do that. And I don't do that because I think I can be an expert in everything. I can't. There are things that I am an expert in. There are things that I'm not. But I am firmly committed to the idea that knowledge is interconnected, and that if we're going to really engage with the world as interconnected, not as this atomized series of little ideas here and here, then we have to be generalists to some degree. But when you do that, the fact is, you can't know everything. And I encounter this when I discuss issues. I discuss figures or thinkers in history, and I've read the works. I've read some of their primary sources. I've read some secondary sources. I can only do so much. And then someone who's an expert, comments in that video and says, "You're just following the school of thought, this particular interpretive school of thought on this particular figure, and you're not dealing with this school of thought, and this school of thought is actually right, and that one's not." And if I tried to do all of that, if I tried to have this vast depth of knowledge of every interpretation of any figure I discussed, well, I'd be pretty limited, and I'd talk about like two people. And I think that that's just the nature of, one, the democratization of knowledge, so that there are so many people that study that have become so narrowed in on such particular fields that if you don't agree with something, or you have a narrow view of something, or you've misrepresented something in some way, that you're immediately going to be, discredited by those people who do have that narrow sense of knowledge. So that's a part of it. But then the second thing is just there's too much to know. Like, there's too much to do. You can't know everything. You can't possibly understand the history of thought in the way that someone like Hegel did. You can't do that today. And Hegel's really the last great figure that even attempted that really did it in much of a comprehensive way at all. And I just don't know that intellectual thought, apart from that comprehensive kind of approach, really is that meaningful. So I hate to say it that way. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be specialists. Of course, you need specialists, but we need generalists too. And I don't even know if it's possible anymore. So the Renaissance, I think, necessitates generalists. And if you don't have that, you don't have a Renaissance. And that idea or that fact is why I'm not sure that there will ever be another Renaissance. I just don't know that it's actually possible to have a Renaissance in this context with the amount of knowledge that we do have and that would be necessary for somebody to really engage with ideas and arts as broadly as was possible at that time. And the third point is, I don't think you can have a Renaissance without religion. I don't think you have a Renaissance without a revival of religion to some very serious degree. And if you're talking about any of the movements that you might identify as a kind of Renaissance, so say you're talking about like the Golden Age of Islam, or say you're talking about the Renaissance, the kind of mini Renaissance you have under Charlemagne, and there's been some debate about that actually historically as to whether that's actually really a Renaissance or not, because maybe that's probably been exaggerated. But then you look at the Renaissance, when you're looking at the European Renaissance, 15th century, these are all in deeply religious contexts. And so you're looking at like Christian, obviously not the Golden Age of Islam, but with the others, you're looking at Christian Europe, which leads toward Renaissance. And there are perceptions of the world and the transcendence of the world and the beauty of the world and the nature of truth of the transcendental. These things are necessary in order to really grab onto any kind of strong view, I think, of the arts that's really going to be transformative in the way that the arts were within, the Renaissance. And when you get to something like a Sturm und Drang, for example, this isn't per se a religious movement, though some of those who are associated with the broader Romantic movement certainly were religious, and some of them Lutheran. Such as Caspar David Friedrich would be, an example of that. And I had the privilege of being involved in the exhibition of his work at the Met. But a lot of the broader, philosophy, the Bildung philosophy, and other things that are kind of related to that are really attempts at trying to recapture Christian art, an art of the Christian West, and grab onto meaning that was inherent to the Christian world, though without the theology that underlies it. And I just don't think that can be done. And there is a reason why a lot of those movements or ideas were so short-lived. Because society no longer had at that point, for that movement, the kind of religious structure that is needed to pass on these things from one generation to the next. And so I think that there is a reason why art in the 20th century, especially the latter half of the 20th century, because I'm a defender of early modern art, but especially in the latter half of the 20th century, art became nothing more than destructive rather than constructive. If there's no perception, if there's no religious heart of a society at all, there is no perception of a transcendent good, then art can't point toward the transcendent good. Then what does art do? Art can only do two things. One is it can just give you subjective aesthetic pleasure. And if that's all you're defining art as, well, things like porn are going to do that probably in a stronger way than actual beautiful art are going to. And then in the second way, you're going to have art that can't construct meaning because there is no real meaning to point to outside of itself, but instead deconstructs meaning. And that's what you have with postmodern art. And so the fact that, modern literary studies and work in the humanities in general has taken such a critical approach and has relied so deeply on post-structuralist philosophies, I don't think is incidental. Like, I don't think it's just that, say, Roland Barthes or Lacan or Derrida or whoever just so happened to have taught this or that philosophy, which happened to have an impact in the academy. And the academy just so happened now to deconstruct art or literature rather than actually speaking about the positive good toward which it points. I think that that's an inevitability when you have gotten rid of a transcendent good altogether. So if there is no transcendent good, which is what you have in a secular society, there is no fundamental meaning in art. It's just subjective. And so the only thing you can do is talk about subjective pleasure or you can tear apart the notion of objective purpose within art. And so I just don't think we're in a place where you can have a Renaissance, not in a meaningful sense, not in a sense of something that is going to broadly impact society in the way that the Renaissance itself did. Now, I certainly hope that I'm wrong about this. I'd love to see something like a Renaissance today, but there would have to be a significant amount of cultural change, a significant amount of change in terms of how we behave and look at technology and ourselves and learning and so many things that I just don't think it's a possibility in the foreseeable future. Though we certainly can, in our own lives, try to delight in the arts, try to love the arts, try to love learning, engage in learning, pass these things on to our children, our families, our communities. But I don't see that happening on a broad cultural scale anytime in the near future. But what do I know? I'm neither the prophet nor the son of a prophet, so I could very well be wrong. Well, make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.